This episode of New Politics was released on the 1st of November, 2025, and produced on the lands of the Wangal and Gadigal people.
The federal government gives up on environmental protection. The Liberal Party keeps going back to their failed nuclear power policies. Australia's slow move towards Southeast Asia, which is where it belongs. And there's not much joy for Sussan Ley, but there's lots of division. I'm Eddie Djokovic.
I'm David Lewis. All of this and more is coming up in this week's episode of New Politics.
And just a reminder that New Politics is produced by independent media. You can listen in, share, subscribe and support New Politics at Patreon and Substack. It's just $5 per month. Or you can donate directly at our website at newpolitics.com.au. And of course, all of this is a good way to support independent journalism.
A political storm once again brewing over long overdue environmental protection laws.
Business have their fingerprints all over this draft legislation. They get a fast track, they get easier, cheaper and faster approvals for their projects.
These laws are a gift to our overseas competitors. They're a red light to jobs and they're a handbrake to investment and development.
The government is determined to pass laws as early as this year that were orphaned in the last parliament, with a grand goal of fast-tracking mining approvals, especially for critical minerals and green energy projects, with new fines and tougher policing of companies and land users that damage the environment.
They're not working for business, they're not working for the environment, and they're not working for our community. So that's why there has to be some urgency in getting these laws changed.
Parliament returned this week in Canberra, and the Albanese government is preparing one of the biggest environmental backdowns in years. The Environment Minister Murray Watt wants to hand key decision-making powers for coal, gas and water-intensive projects back to the states and territories. And as we know, the federal government has got very strong connections to the fossil fuel industries, but it's the state and territory governments that have got the biggest links of all. And within these proposed changes to the Environmental Protection Act, the water trigger, which was put in place in 2013 to protect Australia's groundwater system, that essentially will be removed and replaced with a supposedly streamlined approvals process through bilateral deals with the states. And the supporters of these changes claim that it will all cut red tape and boost regional jobs, and that's what they always say, but these jobs rarely eventuate. But generally and overall, this is a sellout of the environment where there'll be a green light for new mines with weaker scrutiny and less safeguards. And within Queensland, the Northern Territory and Western Australia, the economies of all of these states and territories are dependent on the resources industry. And when you've got fewer checks and fewer balances and they've got more power to decide, it's not hard to see exactly what's going to happen here. And the government is saying that this is essential environmental reform, but it's a complete opposite, David. And we've criticised the government for not using its massive majority to make progressive change, but it's now starting to use its majority to keep destroying the environment and keep delivering favours for the mining industry.
Those ties to the mining industry have to be cut. Tax them out of existence. Bring in mining interests that are much more sympathetic to Australian national interests. And I know that some of the top miners, the big miners, will be saying, oh, but look at all the jobs and look at all the... And we know that their aim is to remove all jobs in the mining industry and have it fully automated, or bring in really cheap labour from overseas, essentially, to keep profits up and prices up for the consumer. The gas travesty of selling gas overseas cheaper than Australians can get it here. It just shows exactly where their mindset is. And they won on that. Now they're trying to do it with everything else. And of course, the coal industry is dying. It'll never go away completely, of course, but the days of big free money for the few is coming to an end. And because they can't monetize solar or wind in the way that you can monetize a more tangible asset like coal. And then, of course, and we'll probably get back to this, the metals that are rising in value like lithium, we sell for a song to the United States. For what? Still not sure. $8 billion or whatever it was, but what's the rest of the advantage there? And the other thing, of course, to worry about is the term national interest. Now, Labor in 1942, 43, 44, and even 45 had lots of national interest overrides. But there was a war on, and there was the perceived, if not actual, threat of invasion. There was the actual threat of being cut off for supplies, and not being able to prosecute the war in a way that would mean that we won. So that it made sense then. And when the war ended, Chifley repealed most of it. Not all of it, but most of it. National interest is one of those things that unless you define it in the legislation, can be used very broadly. Is it in the national interest for a political party to gain an extra 3 seats?
Well, I think that's what the problem is, because the national interest override within the proposed legislation, well, it's not clear what it actually means. And maybe that's the actual point, David, where the new legislation, it also gives the federal environment minister the power to approve projects, even if they do breach Australia's own environmental standards. And within that idea or the definition of the national interest, or, well, it's not really defined, but it's just so vague that it could mean anything. It could mean defence, it could mean security, it could mean economic growth, or as you suggested, it could mean political interests. And this move, it sort of undermines the very nature of the Environmental Protection Act. And that's a law that's designed to make sure that everything is consistent across the nation, and there's also independent oversight of environmental standards all across the country. And now, within these proposed reforms, there's going to be the one minister who's going to have all of these unchecked powers. So it's the minister who will decide whether national interest, whatever that is, can promote a particular project approval. And environmental groups and the Australian Greens are just saying that this is just a corporate wish list that's sort of promoted as this sort of weird national policy. And it's this sort of legal and ethical grey area that just opens up pretty much everything to more fossil fuel expansion. So when the government is talking about acting in the national interest, we just have to wonder whose interest they're actually acting in.
It's a national party. Vague law is bad law, and bad law creates more problems than it solves. Yeah, definition of in the national interest, defence, sure, maybe. Trade, perhaps, maybe. And even then, given some of the hawks in defence, looking at every time Indonesia decides to move a regiment from one island to the other because it makes more sense, it's seen as a move against Australia. Every time China raises a price because the prices have gone up, it's seen as a defensive or an offensive move. Australia flies into Chinese airspace, gets a flare shot at it as a warning, and it's a declaration of war just about. So we can't trust a lot of this stuff. It needs firm and precise definition to be sure that the law can't be abused. But it seems that they want their law to be able to abuse, so they've kept it vague. And vague law is bad law.
Oh, there's also been a lot of anger in the Northern Territory from Aboriginal land councils who said that they've been completely shut out from the government's latest environmental reforms. They haven't even been spoken to. And these land councils have said that they're already living through the effects of climate change. They're dealing with hotter and drier conditions. Water in a lot of those areas is becoming more scarce. And you'd think that a decent government would speak to the communities, and these communities who are going to be affected by more mining. And a lot of this relates to the survival of these communities. It's also about sovereignty and protection of country. And that's all being swept aside. And the government is suggesting that they're going down this path of the sensible centre between the coalition on one side and the Greens on the other. But you can't be a sensible centre if you're not talking at all to Indigenous communities. And a lot of this does relate to that rare minerals deal that was made with the United States last week or the week before. And around 80% of these rare minerals are going to be on Indigenous controlled land or land that's subject to native title claims. So we're not sure what's going to happen here because it's not even being talked about. But it just seems to be another example of corporations in Australia just being given what they want and everyone else can go and get stuffed.
Yeah. We've been a vassal state to the corporation since, and hello to those people who said that we were conspiracy theorists. But it's true that corporations whether they be farming, Australia rides on the sheep's back, mining, BHP was considered almost to wing a government in the 50s and 60s. There's a lot of vested interests who've learnt how to get into what should be the neutral area of Parliament and push things their way. Now, Jacinta Price, I noticed a few weeks back, claimed that the land councils were invalid and crooked and everything that played into the less smart reader of the Australians' prejudices, the Sky After Dark watchers. And they're very good at taking a view of an Indigenous person and saying this is what all Indigenous people think, which is a stupid approach anyway. The Indigenous, as I've said before, the Indigenous people in Australia are a broad community with many opinions, not all of which agree with each other. And it also hinted at the notion that the Australian in particular comes up with all the time, that Indigenous organisations can't run themselves. They should be taking models like the Liberal Party, for example, as a view how to run things. But it's that imperialist, perverse Kipling-esque notion of the white man's burden, trying to help these people by digging up their land. Now, they don't need any of the money from it, or maybe a peppercorn, just enough to shut them up, but not too much that it eats into your profits. It's just an incredible, and it's blatant. And that's the other thing. It's absolutely blatant. No consideration as to why land rights were important and are important. Always was, always will be is not just a pithy slogan. There's a whole philosophy under it, which a lot, not all, but a lot of the mining industry is happy to ignore or to bulldoze over and dig up.
And David, a few weeks ago, a lot of people weren't too happy when we said that the Albanese government is, if you squint a little bit, it's just starting to behave like the Morrison government and starting to look like the Morrison government. But this is exactly what the Liberal Party was doing in office between 2013 to 2022 in mining, and pretty much, whenever else they're in office as well. But progressive voters who backed the Labor government in 2022 and then again in 2025, my feeling is that they were expecting real leadership on the environment, not just a program that's ended up being exactly the same as what the Liberal Party would have implemented. And this could actually create problems for the government at the next election. Now, I know that they've got this massive majority at the moment, but these sorts of things can always cause trouble for a government at the election time. And if you're going too far away from what the voters are expecting from you, you're probably going to suffer at the ballot box. And the government keeps pushing this jobs and investment line. And sure, I'll accept that mining is important to the Australian economy and so is investment, but there just has to be a better balance with the environment. And we might be starting to see the results of that massive majority that the government has got, not in a very good way. And it's not so much the numbers, or I think they've got a majority of 48 seats or whatever it is, but the feeling that they've got that they'll be in government for some time to come, so that they can get up to this sort of behaviour because there won't be any consequences. And it's just another case of Labor becoming exactly the thing that they used to criticise when they were in opposition, and that's boosting the mining industry at the expense of the environment. And I just feel that there will be consequences for them.
What's protecting them, of course, is their masterful manipulation of the preference system. Your protest vote, unless it's in sufficient numbers, ends up going to your preferred side of politics anyway. This isn't to say your vote is wasted or what have you, but Labor knows, and this is how it won last time. It was a genius move to look at what seats can we win on preferences and target those. And that's why it got such a huge majority. Genius move, don't get me wrong. I have a lot of admiration for the sheer tactical brilliance of it. Second-term government who had not inspired as much as people were hoping to come back with such a majority shows that there are smart, very smart campaign people in the Labor Party. And that's good. The Liberal Party needs some of these and may have them. I'll be fair, they may have them because as a few right-wing commentators have correctly pointed out, there's not a lot of votes. There's a lot of seats in it, but a lot of those seats were not won by much. Now, of course, at the moment, the Liberal Party is still all over the place and is a rabble and lacks a clear direction. And that will help Labor. The other thing too Labor's been lucky at is that they haven't had to deal with independent red and green candidates, which may become a factor down the track, because the one thing that a lot of Teal candidates differed from the people they knocked out of office was their approach to the environment. And I think you can say that across the board, one of the biggest worries of the Australian people is the environment. We see the environment change. How many once in a 100-year rainstorms have we had in the last 5 years? And I know that there'll be statisticians out there saying, that's not what once in 100, it doesn't mean that they come every 100 years. No, but it means that the circumstances are such that on average, you'd only get these circumstances coming about once every 100 years, and they're coming once every 3 years. So something is playing with the probabilities. We've just had Hurricane Melissa hit Jamaica with very bad consequence. It's the worst hurricane they've ever seen, I think. We had Cyclone Alfred luckily peter out before it hit landfall. But if it had hit landfall, it would have been disastrous. I know that the SES was very worried about being able to help just because of the number of resources that may have been needed. As it happened, we were lucky. Luck is always a part of it. You can mitigate bad luck, even if you can't legislate against it, as Gough Whitlam said about health. Same with the environment. If we start thinking clearly about how to at least alleviate climate change, we'll do a lot better in terms of managing climate change.
This is New Politics with Eddie Djokovic and David Lewis, the best podcast on Australian politics and news commentary. You can support us through Patreon and Substack, and also find us at newpolitics.com.au.
Greatest missed opportunity of our generation, and that is the failure to harness nuclear energy as part of Australia's energy mix. Because right around the world, nuclear power is being used to provide cheap, safe and zero emissions energy. Nations like China, like India, South Korea and Japan are firing up new nuclear reactors. The United States and the United Kingdom, two governments from opposite sides of politics, are together forging a new civilian nuclear partnership to accelerate advanced reactor technology. Yet, here in Australia, the only developed nation in the G20 that bans itself from even considering nuclear energy as part of its plan for a net zero future.
Just when you thought that it might be safe to go back into the water, the coalition's obsession with nuclear power has returned to the public debate. Liberal Senator Jane Hume has announced that she will introduce a private member's bill to lift Australia's ban on nuclear energy and create the pathway for nuclear power stations. And this is an idea that the Australian electorate rejected thoroughly at the 2025 federal election. And to use the words of George W. Bush, it's like déjà vu all over again. The Liberal Party just keeps dragging out the same dead policy back onto the stage as if to repeat the same story again and again and again and again will somehow make it more credible, but it's not going to work. And Jane Hume said that if we're serious about cutting emissions, well, nuclear has to be part of the mix. And we've heard this story before. It's the same story that they've been repeating for about the past 20 years, and no one is listening to them. And nuclear energy is still the most expensive. It's the slowest and the least practical option on the table at the moment. And there's that fantasy of small modular reactors that don't even exist at a commercial scale, and they barely exist at any sort of scale at all. And Australia does have 30% of the world's uranium resources, but it doesn't have one nuclear reactor, and there's a good reason for that. The cost of managing waste, the long construction timelines, and the public opposition to having a nuclear reactor in your own backyard make all of this politically and practically impossible, yet the Liberal Party just keeps going back there. So it's hard to know what's going on here, David, because the rest of the world is moving ahead with renewable energy. And sure, there's some countries that are still building nuclear power stations, but there's just been so many reports and so many inquiries over the past 60 years that have shown that nuclear is not a viable industry in Australia, not at this stage and probably never will. But the Liberal Party is still going after this nuclear industry for the future, that the voters have told them over and over and over and again that it's not a future that they want to see.
It's exactly right. And it's seen by some, but pointed out that given the long lead time, it's going to be 30 years at least for a nuclear reactor to be built, because you still have to go through building approvals. It took something like...
Well, it also depends on the Liberal Party being in office, and that's probably not going to happen until 2050.
Yeah, it took something like the United Arab Emirates, which don't have the same regulatory roadblocks, shall we say. It still took them 20 years to get a nuclear reactor up without having to go through council approvals, state approvals, federal approvals. The government, they can just say, we're putting it here, and then make sure it's safe, presumably. Here it would take 25 to 30 years. It's really just a way of keeping coal in the mix, because we can have solar energy quite quickly. There's already a lot of solar energy. There's already a lot of wind energy. The wind farms that I think Joe Hockey complained about how ugly they were as you drove into Canberra. And certainly they're much better looking than open cut mining, for example. One of the defining images of my life was driving into Queenstown in Tasmania, down these straight, very in-bend roads, looking at this is many years ago, looking at the damage wrought by the surrounding mining. And hello to all our Tasmanian listeners. As I've said before, I love Tasmania. I think it's a great place. I think it's really a way of getting people to say, oh, well, we'll have to stay on coal because God forbid you try any other quicker, cheaper option, and options that can't be monetized. And I know I said that in the last segment, but I'll say it again. This is it. It's about making rich people richer and stopping other people from getting rich.
I think the weird thing is that these climate wars and the energy wars are still going on, and the Liberal Party couldn't win that war against pretty much everyone else. So now it's a civil war within the coalition that just keeps on going, and within the national parties, within the National and the Liberal Party, and within the Liberal Party itself. So both of these parties are openly fighting each other over the net zero emissions. Nuclear energy is part of that process as well. And this is the same, as far as net zero is concerned, this is the same policy that they signed up to under Scott Morrison when Barnaby Joyce was Deputy Prime Minister, and now he opposes it. So we have Barnaby Joyce, or more correctly, the Minister for Gina Rinehart. Well, he's now leading that charge against net zero, even though he signed up for it in 2018. And then you've got moderate Liberals like Andrew Bragg and Andrew McLaughlin. Well, they're trying to be sensible about all of this, and both in a practical and political sense. But it just seems like the schism within both the Liberal Party and within the National Party, and then between the two of them, just seems to be too deep. And industry has moved on, the electorate has moved on, clean energy is the future. They've made a decision about that quite a few times now, but the Liberal Party just hasn't moved on, and that's just something that is inexplicable.
And they keep losing seats, not to Labor, not to Greens, but to Teal candidates. You take the environment and the treatment of women out of the environment, and there's not a lot of difference between Zali Steggall and Andrew Bragg, for example. Not a lot of difference between Monique Ryan and the moderate wing of the Liberal Party. And I'm not saying this in these deceiving people coming in and telling us that they've never said anything else. That where they split from the Liberal Party is in these couple of key areas. One of those being the environment. And this is the really important bit. Their electors felt the same way. As I said, all of them were straight up open and honest about where they stood, how they stood. When progressives started getting annoyed that these people supported wage cuts, they never said otherwise. They said that openly, that they were Liberal voters who felt disaffected with the party and left, and they left for particular reasons. As a pundit and observer of Australian politics, I don't have to agree with them, but I'm not going to accuse them of being deceptive or disingenuous when they clearly weren't. We can get them in, and we can argue over their policy on wages or unions or welfare. We may find some common ground, we may not. But it comes down to the fact that the Liberal Party is losing, not on their core policies of individualism and entrepreneurialism, but their policies of destroying the environment and keeping the environment as a lower priority than what the people of Australia want. That, and the fact that they're being torn apart by two extreme wings who can't stand each other. But that But that's a product of the environment thing anyway.
But I think ultimately on energy policy and the environment, it comes down to political competence and poor political management. And if a political party can't work out a clear policy after fighting these wars essentially for over 20 years, well, it's got some serious problems. And the electorate agrees with that sentiment, I think, if we look at the results of the 2025 federal election. But I just keep thinking, why do you keep doing this? How can a political party or a political movement just be so bereft and so inept on this particular issue? And in politics, well, you can't just keep wheeling out the same policies and wait for the times to suit you. And sure, that might have worked for John Howard once, but that was just the one time in 1996. The times did suit him at that time. But eventually you just have to give up. And voters look at this sort of stuff and say, look, you're not being serious about this, so we're not going to be serious about you. And as far as I'm concerned, the Liberal Party doesn't really have to propose something that's diametrically opposed to the Labor government. It shouldn't be a case where, oh, well, the Labor government's doing this, so we'll do the complete opposite to get electoral success. They don't always have to go for the nuclear option, literally and metaphorically. They could say, well, yes, we support net zero, but we'll do it differently, and here are our options. That's what policy development is. That's called hard work. And David, I just really hate being the informal advisor to the Liberal Party, but that's what you have to do. People are over the stupid games on climate and energy and nuclear energy. You've lost the battle. You've lost the war. You've lost everything. Just Liberal Party, just grow up and start getting real. That's what you got to do.
It's like those Japanese soldiers who continue fighting the war in the Pacific till 1972, and they have to actually get the they get the commanding officer to fly out and say, it ended 22 years ago, fellas, whatever it was, 27 years ago. You can go home, you've done well. And they spent years stealing supplies and getting into gunfights with local authorities and things like that. They thought that the war has ended was propaganda from the Americans. And until they could hear it from a proper source, they weren't going to give up. And this is the Liberal Party.
Well, what's going to be the proper source for the Liberal Party? Where do they need to hear it from? They're not listening to the voters.
No, I don't know. And this is, at least these soldiers could. It was the commanding officer who came through and said, no, guys, it's over. Let's go home. Well done. Good job. I don't know what's going to happen, except I think the party's going to render itself apart in a major way, having two minor parties that won't go anywhere. One made up of moderates plus a lot of right-wing chancers, and one made up of the extreme right-wing, possibly led by Andrew Hastie, possibly led by someone else. I like good oppositions, and we haven't had a good Liberal opposition since probably John Howard in 94, 95. Sometimes, of course, they were stymied by their own party. The Liberal Party is masterful at shooting itself in the foot while in opposition. So is the Labor Party, of course, and the Labor Party can do it in government. A lot of the reforming zeal of the Hawke-Keating government was fired by strong oppositions, and then to the good luck of the Hawke, they'd blow themselves apart. John Howard would decide, no, it is time for me, and roll Andrew Peacock. But while they were running properly in those brief periods of time, they actually helped make those Hawke-Keating reforms a little bit better, because Hawke and Keating had to make very good policy for the public to buy it. And that's what a good opposition should do. It shouldn't just say no. This is why Tony Abbott was a failure as an opposition leader, and I know that's a minority opinion. But a good opposition shapes policy, both for themselves, but also makes sure that the government puts in stronger cases. And so I would much prefer a strong Liberal Party, even at the risk of losing a Labor Party or a progressive government. I'd much rather have a good opposition who thinks about things, who holds the government to account. Yes, this part is good, we're keeping this, but we don't like this part. That's okay. You don't have to say, no, all of it's gone. And that's where we're at with the Liberal Party. They think that because Tony Abbott won an election once, that's the way to oppose. I have a sense Sussan Ley knows this to some level, but there's other issues going on there, which are party-based.
The Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, attended the ASEAN meeting in Malaysia this week, and this is really the place where Australia belongs, in Southeast Asia. But the events at the summit show that it's still wedged between China and the United States. On the one hand, we sell iron ore to China, and that's the foundation of our economy. But on the other hand, we're looking at the United States for the foundations of our defence systems. And I think that's the paradox of Australia. We profit from China, but rely on America for protection. And there's no question at all, David, that the meeting that Anthony Albanese had with Donald Trump a couple of weeks ago, that was a diplomatic success. He also had another meeting with him at APEC in South Korea during the week, and we've still got massive reservations about the outcomes from both of these meetings. But the ASEAN meeting had different agendas and different outcomes, where Albanese had to be seen to be having a stern word to the Chinese Premier Li Qiang about the flares that were dropped near an Australian patrol aircraft in the South China Sea a few weeks ago, and he just had to make sure that people could see that happening. But essentially, this is all a geopolitical balancing act that Australia has to do. The ASEAN meeting should have attracted a lot more media attention than the visit with Donald Trump in the US, because Southeast Asia is far more important to Australia. And that balance is about not offending allies in the region. It's trying to say that Australia has autonomy, even though it really doesn't, and making it look like it's not too close to the United States, and trying to then look like it's not too close to Southeast Asia and to different audiences. And I think it's just hard to keep this appearance up. And so far it seems to be working, but it's just a question of how long it will work for.
There is an assumption within some members of parliament, I think, and it's an ingrained one, and they probably don't really know that they have it, that countries like Malaysia and Singapore and Indonesia are a little bit less developed than Australia. Now, again, it's not everyone in foreign affairs. In fact, it's probably no one in the public service, and it's probably coming from outside the ministerial and prime ministerial offices as well. It's a long-held misconception. Penny Wong, of course, she is closer to understanding what's going on there than, say, Gareth Evans was, or Alexander Downer, for God's sake. And when it comes to this type of stuff, Penny Wong is very good. It's her Middle Eastern work which has been the disappointing aspect of her career. I think Penny Wong shows countries like Malaysia in particular, but also Singapore, Indonesia, Korea, Vietnam, that Australia takes the area very seriously, as we should. And as the Labor Party pushes more towards moving back to America, it becomes disappointing that instead of being a major partner and even the superpower in the area, although I think we're losing that superpower as the Korean economy grows, as the Vietnamese economy grows, as the Singaporean economy powers along, as the Malaysian economy grows. The Australian economy is growing too, but it's quite likely will be caught up, be surpassed even by some of these. And in fact, I think Korea has a bigger economy. The Korean economy is very robust. The Indonesian economy has room for growth and has a government that wants to grow it and has a population about 10 times the size of Australia. So if they can manage, and there's no reason why they can't, that I can see, to get their workforce operating at an efficiency of the Australian workforce, they will become a major world economic power too.
Or maybe through the attendance at the ASEAN and the APEC meeting as well, it seems like Australia is starting to slowly shift its trading future towards Southeast Asia. And the Prime Minister is making that slow, but it seems like it's a slowly deliberate push to move Australia's focus away from its over-reliance on these two economic powers, China and the United States. And that to me makes a lot of sense. Southeast Asia is a region that's booming. It's making sense to have better economic and cultural ties with countries in this region that we're in. And by 2040, the Southeast Asia bloc has been predicted to become the world's fourth largest economy as a bloc. And who knows, by that time there might be moves to make this a more solid union, an economic union similar to the EU. And some countries in this region also want to be part of the BRICS movement as well. So there's a lot of dynamic change that could happen in this region over the next 10, 15, 20 years. So it just makes sense for Australia to be a part of all this action.
Yeah, and you got to be a part of the action. Otherwise, if you're not a part of it, you're nobody. You're a pariah.
That's right. If you're not at the table, you're not at the table.
Yeah, and you become any of those African countries or South American countries. You don't want to be Colombia or Haiti, where you're just not a part of the big decisions. You want to be, to quote Hamilton, the musical, you want to be in the room where it happens, because if you're not there, you're nowhere. And don't think, particularly under the current administration in the States, that America will stand steadfastly with Australia. One of victories of Anthony Albanese was getting Donald Trump to call him a great prime minister, which you could see the cognitive dissonance in Sky News hosts and some of as they wanted to criticize it, and they couldn't because he got everything that they would have got. Being praised by Trump is like having the school bully tell you that you're a good guy. Hold on, what's wrong with me that these guys are?
Oh, that's probably all good diplomatically, but
sure,
the essence of this sort of change is that we'll comment about those sort of things once all the Asian leaders start saying good things about the Prime Minister. That should be the focus of the media attention. And Paul Keating did once say that we are an Asian country and said that we have to find our security in Asia and not security from Asia. And he said that in the 1990s, so that's over 30 years ago. And at the time, there were howls of outrage. But I think when people looked around and had a look at the map and looked at the globe, they said, oh, actually, yes, we are in Asia. We are part of Asia. We're all Asians now. And Australia's future just can't be tied to the big powers anymore. I know that those structures are still in place, but our future is not in Europe. It's not in the United States. It's here within this region, and countries in this region like Malaysia, like Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, Philippines, they're making their own deals. And the tariffs and protectionism of the United States, that's speeding up this process of deal making. And that's the other message. The United States is just concerned about itself, and it will always act in its own interests. And it's always been that way. And I guess that's what most countries do anyway. And that situation will probably make all of these arrangements and all the deals that have to be made a lot more complex. But we do live in a complex world, and we just have to get used to it.
Putting a date on it's interesting. You could say 2001 with the bombing of the World Trade Centers, and suddenly America becomes less relevant. You could say 1989 with the end of the Cold War, and you don't need the American superpower anymore, or 1991 or 1992. I'll let you all argue it out in the comments. You could say Australia's need stops in 72 with the election of the Whitlam government, but also with the withdrawal of troops from Vietnam, because we knew even then helping America in that type of conflict wasn't going to help, even though we then do it again in Iraq 1 and Iraq 2, or Gulf War 1 and Gulf War 2, and Afghanistan and Indonesia is a bit different. So finding that point where American reliance becomes irrelevant is hard, and there's a few good candidates for it. And it could be that it's just this long, slow slide, that there's no one date. It's just as the American empire declines, that's when it is. And that we don't want to be like the vassal states of Rome at the fall of the Roman Empire. We want to be Gaul and England and all of those places that managed to thrive after the fall of the Roman Empire, not those places like most of Italy that managed to fall into disarray for centuries. And we can do this without offending America. With the current administration in America, nothing sticks, nothing holds, and who cares? We can do it without offending China. China, most foreign policy people understand that all countries act in their own national self-interest first. And that if Australia wants to be a strong player in this part of the world, China mightn't like it, but they at least will understand it. Until we get a proper US president, which could be any time from now, and it mightn't be for 15 years or something, we may as well ignore what's going on there. Yep, sure, keep trading. Yep, try and extract the money that they owe us from them. Still admire those elements of American culture that we in Australia admire: Hollywood, rock and roll, jazz, hip hop, comics, and on it goes. We can do that while ignoring and even disliking the administration running it at the moment. Yeah, we've got to grow up, and we've had to grow up since really 1931 with the passage of the Statute of Westminster and the Balfour Declaration in 1929. which is where basically Britain said, yeah, we don't need you advanced colonies anymore. And then, of course, 1945, it's all over for Britain. The country's broke. It was really over in 1918. But we turned to America during the war because we had to. Okay. After then, though, we can say, thanks, guys. You're always welcome. Drop in anytime you like. But we're not giving you a military base in the middle of the country. And we're going to look at trade. And it is remarkable. It's not till Keating that despite trade going on from the 1890s with Indonesia, for example, and even before, and there were Japanese delegations come in the 1800s to Australia, that nobody stopped to think, oh, hold on, look at all these great markets here, right on our doorstep. Look at all the money we're saving by not having to travel halfway around the world. But yeah, sometimes you can't see the trees for the palm of your hand or whatever it is.
This is New Politics, available through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Audible and YouTube, and also available to support at Patreon, Substack, and at our website, newpolitics.com.au.
In one of the more ridiculous criticisms of her Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, Sussan Ley, went all post-punk in Parliament during the week when she made the spurious link between Joy Division and anti-Semitism, which of course means that because Anthony Albanese wore a Joy Division t-shirt, he's obviously anti-Semitic.
Australians expect their Prime Minister to show judgment, respect and leadership. Instead, we have got the opposite. Arriving back in Australia from his overseas trip, the Prime Minister stepped off the plane proudly wearing a T-shirt with the name of a band, Joy Division, whose origins are steeped in anti-Semitism. The name was taken from the wing of a Nazi concentration camp where Jewish women were forced into sexual slavery. At a time when Jewish Australians are facing a rise in anti-Semitism, when families are asking for reassurance and unity, the Prime Minister chose to parade an image derived from hatred and suffering. This is not a slip of judgment, and he cannot claim ignorance. He was told about the dark origins of this band on a podcast in 2022. He even admitted that is very dark. He knew, he understood, and still he wore the T-shirt. So to wear that name across your chest is not just a statement of musical taste, and it is more than bad taste. It raises questions about values, the wrong values, and it is a profound failure of judgment. For the Prime Minister of this country, in full knowledge of the meaning behind the name of this band, to choose to wear this T-shirt is an insult to all, and it fails the basic tests of leadership. He should apologise immediately and explain why he thought this was acceptable.
Member for Swan.
And this all came about because the Prime Minister walked off the Air Force plane after returning from his visit to the United States, not in a prime ministerial suit, but wearing a pair of jeans, R.M. William boots and a Joy Division T-shirt. And I'm not sure if people are familiar with it, but it's a black T-shirt with a waveform on it and the words Joy Division above it. And Sussan Ley tried to make that spurious claim that Joy Division is a band that is anti-Semitic and that the name refers to the use of Jewish women in Nazi brothels, which is wrong on all counts. There were actually no Jewish women used in these brothels. The name itself comes from the novel written by Kasetnik, 135633, and the name of that novel is The House of Dolls. And with Joy Division itself, well, it is true that members of the band did read a lot about World War II history and Nazi propaganda, but to make this correlation between Joy Division and anti-Semitism and then try and latch that onto the Prime Minister shows that the Leader of the Opposition has got pretty much nothing to offer to the public, just at a time when there's just so many other issues to deal with. And I'd actually be more critical of Anthony Albanese for trying to get into the zeitgeist with a band that's almost 50 years old. We could criticise him for that, but not for wearing a Joy Division T-shirt.
I prefer New Order myself. But do we become anti-Semitic because we enjoy faulty towers? Don't mention the war. because we can draw a long bow between what John Cleese was laughing at, which was that parochial English, we won the war 30 years ago, so ha. And that's one of the most popular episodes in Germany, by the way. The Germans got it. He wasn't laughing at Germans, he was laughing at British. Do we not watch Quentin Tarantino's Inglourious Bastards? Because there are Nazis in that. In fact, Hitler appears in that film. For a party of free speech and who don't believe in cancel culture, it was the strangest. And the other thing too, punk and new wave sensibility did have an obsession with Nazi memorabilia. David Bowie's a bit problematic, but he was wearing Nazi regalia in his concerts and things. The Sex Pistols had swastikas all over themselves, as did many punk bands. And it was a reaction to, it was partly to provoke their parents and grandparents, many of whom had a memory of the war. And if you look at television of the 70s and 80s, there's 1,000 shows, and the 60s, 1,000 shows, it seems, set during World War II, partly because the audience remembered it somewhat fondly, from Hogan's Heroes through to Allo Allo, through to The Secret Army, through to the Sullivans in Australia. And so the use of Nazi memorabilia was not as a support of this, but partly as a protest of it, to try and reclaim it, but also as a way of annoying your grandfather who didn't like the way you cut your hair and the loud music you listened to. And so this debate ended just naturally as music moves on. Ian Curtis, of course, sadly ends his life in 1980, and the remaining members of the band form New Order.
Well, another reference to Nazism.
But again, nobody accused Peter Hook of being a Nazi or being an anti-Semite, because that wasn't the point. In fact, 1964, in Adelaide, the Beatles throw their hands up in a Nazi salute as 1 million people crowd underneath the balcony there on the street there. Those of you who live in Adelaide know what I'm talking about. Those of you who don't, it's worth looking at. It's not as big as it looks. It's just this moderately sized building. Must have been an incredible experience, but they knew exactly what it meant. And I don't think anyone has ever accused Paul McCartney or John Lennon of being fascists, being anti-Jewish.
But I guess with this process, you just left wondering, well, what was Sussan Ley trying to do this week? And that's not entirely clear. Maybe a signal to the Israel lobby that she's still on their side, or some weird attempt to paint Anthony Albanese as anti-Semitic. And as I referred to before, the members of Joy Division, first of all, their name was Warsaw, then they became Joy Division, and then after that, New Order, but after the death of Ian Curtis. And they did have that fascination with World War II history and Nazi propaganda. And punk bands and post-punk bands have that element of shock to them. And I guess that's what they were trying to do back in 1980 or whatever it was. And the issue is that there's nothing in their songs that suggests any level of anti-Semitism. So but what are we going to do now? Are we going to start analysing their songs and lyrics like Blue Monday, I See a Ship in the Harbour? Well, that's obviously anti-Semitic somehow. We've got to do something about that. Love will tear us apart. Is that anti-Semitic too? And if it's not, we'll find something in there. So it's sort of got to this ridiculous level. And usually with these sorts of issues, the pro-Israel and the Zionist lobby in Australia will try and amplify this sort of issue, but they said nothing because there's just nothing there. And it's almost reached a point when, and you've referred to this quite a few times, David, over the past couple of years, where if everything is deemed to be anti-Semitic, well, then nothing ends up being anti-Semitic. And it's been so overused that it's almost become meaningless. And that was the problem with Sussan Ley during the week, I think.
Yeah, and she claims to have an interest in punk aesthetic, and even suggested she might have been a punk as a younger woman. I'm not going to argue what Sussan Ley got up to in her younger days. I don't know, I wasn't there. But it would suggest to me that she wasn't looking very closely and maybe didn't understand what it was she was getting into. And of course, there are a lot of hangers-on in punk who thought it was cool and was a way of getting drugs and going to concerts and all of that. And none of that's any of my business. What Sussan Ley got up to when she was a teenager into young 20s is none of my business. But I do suspect that she wasn't looking very closely as to what any of this meant and the deeper implications. The Boomtown Rats had a song, I Never Loved Eva Braun, which was an analysis of Adolf Hitler, but underneath that was a A reminiscence on personal responsibility, using Hitler as, I just like the uniforms and I didn't mean to do anything. It got banned from the BBC, of course, but it's a very interesting song and it's a theme Bob Geldof continually returns to, personal responsibility and what are you responsible for, leading to Live Aid and all of that. So, yeah, nice try. I suspect it shows that even the coalition saw Anthony Albanese's trip as a triumph, because surely she could have said he sold those minerals off too cheaply. And the whole he got off the plane in a T-shirt thing. It's a long flight.
Well, it is, but to suggest that Sussan Ley is in a lot of political trouble at the moment is pretty much an understatement. And it's sort of reaching that same point that Peter Dutton got to as well, where he was the leader of the Liberal Party because there was just no one else. And sure, someone has to be the leader of the Liberal Party, but there's just nothing of substance there. So if it's not Sussan Ley, well, who else is it going to be? And the coalition is really wallowing in the polls. And yet again, this just keeps going from, bad to worse to mediocre to absolutely abysmal. But their primary vote in the latest Essential poll is just at 26%. And that's so low that it's embarrassing. And in that same poll, Labor is sitting at 36%. And Anthony Albanese, I think he's reached that point that most long-term or longer-term prime ministers eventually get to, and that's that point where the public just accepts that they are the prime minister. And I think John Howard got to that point maybe 2001. Bob Hawke had it around 1987 or 1988. And that's that issue that once the electorate gets used to a leader in the job, it's hard for them to imagine anyone else in the job. And of course, that can change very, very quickly. But there has to be an effective opposition to capitalise on that moment when it does arrive. And this is not the opposition to do that sort of stuff, or the opposition leader that can capitalise when that moment arrives. And if the best that they can do is try and muster up, or the best that Sussan Ley can do is try and muster up a bit of controversy over a post-punk T-shirt design that's almost 50 years old, well, I think they just got to give up. And during the week, there were all those issues about pedophiles and slack regulation in early childhood education all across Australia. And that's a big issue. There was a big report on Four Corners during the week. And that's something that Sussan Ley could have focused on. In inflation figures, tried a little bit on that and then gave up. There's the ongoing genocide in Gaza. Sussan Ley could speak up about that if she wanted to make herself relevant. But I think these types of stunts and these sorts of events, I think it just goes to show that the Liberal Party has got a really, really, really long and hard road ahead of it, and it's still parked in reverse, it's still in the bog, whatever. It's not even on the road at the moment, and whichever cliche you can think about, that's where they are at the moment. It's just going to be a long, long road ahead for them.
Yeah, I don't want to say there's no coming back, but coming back's going to be extremely difficult. And she started well, but she's starting to stumble too much. So I wonder, and we didn't think Peter Dutton would make the election, but he did. He probably wishes he didn't in some kind of way, given the results. But
the other thing, David, if you're going to do a stunt, you've got to make sure that it works.
Yeah.
It's the thing.
Yeah. She should have spoken to some of her colleagues, and she might have, and they might have said, yeah, get him on anti-Semitism, we've got him. But she should have looked outside the bubble and spoken to actual people who know the punk. If she doesn't want to speak to punks, speak to somebody like Glenn A. Baker or Stuart Coop, who'd say, well, no, it doesn't mean what you think it means, and nobody will take it to mean what you think it means, leave it alone. Yeah, could have spoken to us, because the phone's always there.
That's it for this episode of New Politics. Thanks for listening in. And if you'd like to support our style of journalism and commentary, please make a donation at our website at newpolitics.com.au. We don't beg, plead, beseech or gaslight you about journalism coming to an end. We just keep it very simple. If you like what we do, please send some support our way. It keeps our commitment to independent journalism ticking along. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. We'll see you next time.